I'm supporting Flourishing Metrics, which is the company that we're featuring here with Dr. Todd Hall, and led by none other than Mike Dulworth, the CEO of our fantastic executive networks. I want to make sure that he has a chance to say hello and get this thing started. So with that, Mike, thank you.
Thanks, Marie. Yeah, really happy to be here today. As some of you know, this is my new passion area, what we call flourishing. A lot of people use the word well-being, and Tyler and Todd from Harvard, the Human Flourishing program at Harvard, basically say that well-being and flourishing are interchangeable as words and the meaning behind those words. So, we've kind of evolved from wellness as a focus in organizations to potentially well-being. And we do have a little bit of a bias that this idea of flourishing is maybe a little bit more complete, inclusive, and it just seems, I don't know, seems more of a positive word to me, quite frankly, than well-being's a good word, but flourishing, we want our organizations to flourish. We want our employees to flourish. Seems like a good word to rally around in this context. So we're just going to give a little background here. Here's the agenda, a little bit of a macro overview, what we're doing at Executive Networks around this. As Marie said, we've actually formed two different companies with Harvard and the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. One's called Flourish, FLERISH.com, and then flourishingmetrics.com. And they do two, different things, but it's kind of now an ecosystem or a family of companies that are trying to help organizations and individuals flourish at the end of the day. So we want to make this pretty practical too. So we're going to try to bring in some of your thoughts and ideas, as Marie mentioned, throughout the next 50 minutes that we have here. So this won't be surprising, I don't think, to any of you, but this idea of well-being is really top of mind. I think organizations we're starting to think about this in earnest, even pre-pandemic, but certainly the pandemic has accelerated the need for organizations to really think quite differently about how they approach and help their employees, thrive in this, current environment. And I don't think personally that this is something that we're going to figure out over the next, months or even, year. I think that the changes that have actually happened over the last couple of years, there's going to be a lot of real angst on the part of employees and people as they try to grapple with what has actually happened over the last 2 years. I mean, in the United States, 750,000 plus people have died. I'm not sure we've really absorbed that, as a country, and it's of course, happened in many, many, many countries around the world, and we're not clearly out of the woods yet, right? We're getting boosters. There's new variants, so this has a pretty long tail, I think, to it, and how we're going to have to adapt as organizations. I think it's still fairly unclear. I was having a drink with the CHRO of PepsiCo last week in New York, and he was saying how it's just such uncharted territory for them as an executive team and as a board to make decisions around things related to the organization's needs and the employees' needs, and matching those two things up is not very simple today, and much more complicated, and things are changing, daily, that they have to address pretty holistically. So, I'm looking at an article right now by Bill Passmore on my desk at Columbia, and it's called "It's a New Game: Leading Complex Continuous Change." Right. And I think it's a good title, and I'm really, interested in what Bill has to say about that. So, here's some, things that are going on in the marketplace and in research that are showing that this is a big deal. The thing that we're kind of most psyched about is maybe some of you have seen this press release that came out of Harvard and Baylor. Todd's obviously a part of this at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. This study is being led by Dr. Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard, and it's the biggest longitudinal study of well-being, flourishing ever attempted. So it's going to track 240,000 people from 22 countries for 5 years. And they're going to take this big kind of 100-question assessment that Gallup is administering every month for 5 years. And it's going to be the richest, biggest data set ever on this topic. And, because of our partnership with Harvard and these companies we formed with them, we're going to be kind of at the forefront of that, or kind of have early access to that information over the next 5 years. And I'm sure other things will be done off of that, for the next 10 years. And I think that's actually the horizon that we're looking at here in terms of organizational transformation and the things that will have to be done to adapt to the new world over this period of time. But, lots of money going into this by venture firms, and PE firms are starting to roll up those venture, startups and all those kinds of things. So very dynamic place to be right now. And we really have this perspective at Executive Networks that, this can't just be a focus on the individuals, that companies and organizations have a very critical part in helping individuals flourish, and ultimately that this is really crucial to the flourishing of the enterprise. And I stole this quote, this phrase from an academic at Berkeley. He kind of has this new book coming out called Growth for Both. The idea that, you really can't separate, what's going on, the needs organizationally with the needs of the employees and vice versa. So we need to be on this path of growth for both. Another one of my CHROs in my network had this phrase that I also stole. I'm big on stealing stuff. She said that caring is the new competitive advantage. Caring is the new competitive advantage. And so I think that this is an interesting way to think about what organizations need to do differently, probably much differently than they did, a couple years ago. And we're going to talk about some of those things today. And so we think that the unifying element here might be managers and team leaders. So, be from the organization's strategy, organization's need, down to individual employee needs, what's the glue that binds those two things together? What's the integration point where it kind of rubber meets the road, if you will. And we think it's managers and team leaders. So we're really interested in working, with our network and with the ecosystem that we have to try to figure that connectivity out and what that really means. And quite frankly, what it means for managers and team leaders to operate in ways that they haven't operated in the past. And of course, what does this mean, even more in a digital context or in a virtual context? So these things are all things that we're very interested in working on. And so, we think that data is super important to this, and everything that we're doing is in the kind of starts with data and starts with what I call evidence and fact that kind of comes out of the research at Harvard and other areas of research like Todd is doing at his university, and you'll see some of that. But we really want to focus in on the connectivity between employee data and employee experience, and how this really, shows up, for people in a very direct way. So we're going to have a poll question here. I'm going to turn it over to Trey to get this going, and at the same time introduce Dr. Todd Hall from the Human Flourishing program, and he's also a professor of psychology at Rosemont, and also as a clinical psychologist, right, and has his own practice, so has really deep expertise in this area.
Zoom fatigue is a good one. I think we're all struggling on that as we sit here on Zoom.
I love these word clouds.
Yeah, this is great. Mental health is also a big one we're hearing a lot about. It's showing up here.
Yes. And we're lucky to have you with us today, Dr. Hall.
Yeah,
We
there
need
was a
you.
new phrase for work-life balance, and I'll try to remember it, that I saw in some article that I was like, okay, that's where we are. There's no longer any work-life balance. There's no separation between the two. There you go. I think that's it.
Integration.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Integration,
See,
yeah.
that's a good one. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
I've also heard
Sissy.
people talk about work-life rhythms.
Oh,
Yeah, that's a good one.
good. Yeah, we encourage you to keep adding your comments to this. We'll build this out, and again, we'll be sharing all of this as a follow-up with everyone here.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's great to be with you all today. And so before jumping into a little bit about the assessment and the results of the study we did, I want to just highlight why we started this company. Mike sort of talked about a little bit the need for flourishing metrics. And the first reason is, as we all know, work is changing. And we really think that the rapidly changing dynamics of the workplace, especially in the context of COVID, has exposed this need for companies to support employee well-being in a more holistic way. And that leads to the second point there, that new paradigms are needed. As you all know, traditional well-being programs tend to focus on physical and mental health, and those are very, very important, but really that's going to be inadequate in the world of tomorrow. We need a more comprehensive view of employees as whole persons. So that's our big emphasis here. If we're going to really understand what helps people to flourish and help them to do that through companies. And the third point is this adage you've probably heard: we manage what we measure. So we've got to measure these things. A holistic understanding of employee flourishing requires new measures. And so the Flourish assessment that I'll share a little bit more with you about momentarily was developed by faculty at Harvard University in partnership with Flourishing Metrics. And that is just such a measure to help us understand and manage flourishing. And then next, problems are not solved in isolation. If we're going to really move the needle in this area, it's got to be a collaborative effort. And so in order to do that, we are partnering with executive networks to form a new peer network that's focused on flourishing, and Flourishing Metrics will be the data arm of that. And you'll hear a little bit more about that later. Finally, employees are telling us that flourishing is very important to them. So we have data when we ask, employees, how important is flourishing to you? And they're on average, they're rating it as a 9 on a 10-point scale. So we're seeing that, we're hearing that in our conversations. We're also seeing the data from millennials and Gen Z that flourishing and mental health are very important to them. They want their companies to address these issues and needs. So those were some of the driving factors for starting this company, Flourishing Metrics. Mike, you can go to the next slide there. So who is Flourishing Metrics? It's a joint venture partnership with Harvard University, executive networks, and researchers from Harvard's Human Flourishing Program. And we have a worldwide license for the commercial use of Harvard's Flourishing Index to help companies promote flourishing. And then, as I mentioned, we're partnering with executive networks to form this new global well-being innovation network that we'll tell you a little bit about more later. So how do we understand and define flourishing? It's a huge topic. We could spend all day on this, and maybe we'll come back to this at some point. But so there's this term eudaimonia that Aristotle talked about. So going way back to Aristotle, and it's translated in a number of ways, often translated as happiness, sometimes a life well lived, sometimes well-being that Mike mentioned. And it's also translated as flourishing, and that's the term that we focus on and use. And really it's getting at a broader concept than happiness, as we tend to use the term in the English language. And in modern psychology, there are two sort of major approaches to flourishing and eudaimonia, and those focus on life satisfaction and then virtues and meaning. So those are kind of two lines of research. And we really think they're both important. And so Dr. Vanderwill and his initial work and all the work they continue that we do at Harvard brings both of these together. And so we take a holistic view also in terms of the domains of a person's life, and believe that all domains of life affect each other and need to work together toward flourishing. And so we've identified 7 key domains for this assessment. So you can go to the next slide there, Mike, and we'll take a look at these domains. So Dr. Vanderwill did this work to develop the Flourish Index with these domains. And so all of these domains are relevant across cultures, universally desired, and constitute their own end. And you can see the 7 domains on the right side there: happiness and life satisfaction, mental health, physical health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, which is one that gets overlooked often in discussions of well-being, social relationships, and then financial and material stability. So it's a fairly holistic view of flourishing that covers a lot of domains. And so these are the ones that we measure and assess. So we have expanded the Flourishing Index and developed a Flourish assessment, and it's still a very brief measure. This is the measure that we are taking to companies to help companies measure and manage flourishing. It takes approximately 10 minutes or less, so it's very brief. It's got 2 sections. The first section is the original index, and that's 12 questions that gives us a high-level assessment of the 7 domains. And then section 2 drills down into specific areas within each of the 7 domains to provide some more detail and actionable items within those domains. You can go to the next slide here, Mike. In terms of the validity, if there's any research stats geeks on the call, I'm happy to talk more about this later. I'll try to go through this quickly, but there's been a lot of research on this measure to validate it. That's important to us, that we are operating out of empirical evidence. Dr. Vanderwill's done a lot of this research. And so one of the techniques you do to validate a measure is called a factor analysis, to show that the items hang together and measure one idea or construct. And so we have data that show that. We also have data that shows strong reliability or internal consistency. Another really important aspect for validating a measure is called convergent validity. And we do have a lot of data showing that the scales correlate as we would expect with other measures. And so we have data that show correlates with job satisfaction, perceived performance, discretionary effort, among other things. We also have data that Dr. Vanderwill's collected that shows that flourishing measure predicts work-related outcomes longitudinally over time, which is rare to have that data. And so that allows us to start to talk about causation. So there's a lot of work to validate this measure. Next slide here. So here's an example of the report that we've developed and are providing to companies, and we're working on expanding this even further to be more interactive. But we provide an overall flourishing index, so you can see on the left there. And then on the right, we provide a domain score, so an overall score for each domain, along with a benchmark score for all companies in our database. And we're working toward data to segment it by industry so that we can provide norms based on the industry. So that's the first part of the report. And the next slide shows, after that, it drills into the 7 domains and the specific areas within each domain with a matrix report that you can see here. And so there are 2 dimensions. There's the health dimension on the x-axis or the horizontal axis. And then on the vertical axis, we have importance. And so that provides these 4 quadrants. And you're probably familiar with charts like this sort of key driver analysis. And so it really provides a very easy to understand and actionable report for managers to quickly see how their employees are doing. And in the top right quadrant, you can see that's the celebrate quadrant. And so those are areas that employees are saying we're doing well in these areas, and they're also important to us. So you want to celebrate those. And then the top left is what we call prioritize. So those are areas that employees are saying, this is important to us, but we're not doing well. We're struggling in these areas. And so that quickly allows managers and companies to zero in on areas that they need to really look at and take action on. And then the bottom, we have maintain and review. So we conducted a study, and we are expanding this further, but we've got initial results from this study looking at employees in the Global 1000. And the purpose was to better understand the flourishing of Global 1000 employees. And one of the things we've discovered over time is this is very difficult data to get. We have some stories about that. So it makes the study very valuable when it's really hard to get this data. And we wanted to also compare managers to non-managers and then identify specific areas in general that need to be prioritized so we can start this conversation with companies, as well as helping companies with their specific report, but just some general data. So how are companies doing overall? The overall average flourishing score for individuals across our study and data set was 7.9. So that's in the flourishing range. So that was encouraging to see. However, we found when we drill down and look at managers versus non-managers, we start to see some really interesting differences. So a little bit about the demographics of the study. We had 515 participants, 178 unique organizations represented. You can see on the left, bottom left, the highest frequency organizations: Abbott, Adidas, Amazon, Walmart. And so we had 388 managers, 127 non-managers. In terms of the demographic breakdown, the typical non-manager was a 25 to 34-year-old white male with 10 plus years of tenure in the company, working in the sales or finance area located in North America. The typical manager was a 35 to 44-year-old white female, although Asian was a close second there, with 5 to 10 years of tenure in the company, working in the finance and accounting area located in Asia. So as I mentioned, we really found that these were two distinct groups. Managers scored quite a bit higher in general, pretty much across the board. And so we separated these groups out and really looked at them as two groups. So we've got a little more detail on those results here. So the overall flourishing score for managers was 8.3 versus a score of 6.8 for non-managers. So that's a pretty big difference that we think is pretty interesting. And secondly, all the domain scores for managers were in what we call the flourishing range, above 7.5 on our scale. And that comes from normative data that Dr. Vanderwill collected prior to the study. All the non-managers scores, domain scores, were in the average range, so between 6.0 and 7.5. The lowest scores for managers were mental health and the financial area, and the lowest scores for non-managers were happiness and life satisfaction and the financial area also. On the right side there, you can see we broke down some of the demographics for managers and non-managers, and at the top there, looking at the managers, the females scored higher than the males among the managers. In terms of the tenure, the group that had been there 6 months to 2 years and 5 to 10 years scored the highest. So we see the groups that are there for a very short period of time, up to 6 months, and then 2 to 5 years are struggling a little bit more. In terms of age, the 25 to 44 group scored the highest, and the older age range of 55 to 74 scored the lowest among managers, which is different than what we see in the sort of general well-being literature out there, that older folks tend to be scoring higher. So that's noteworthy. Looking at the non-managers, the males scored a little bit higher than females for the non-managers. In terms of tenure, the group that had been there less than 6 months scored the lowest. So the people who are just starting out in their companies for non-managers are struggling the most. In terms of age, we see a different trend for non-managers. The 55 and up score the highest, so the older folks are scoring higher, and 35 to 54 are scoring lower.
I'd like to double click on this a little bit.
Yeah, go for it, Mike.
Todd. And, and I just go back to the first line here, the 8.3 versus the 6.8. And what it raises for me is a couple things. And the main thing it raises is that if we're trying to help all employees, have higher, well-being scores or thrive more, right? There's a big disconnect in organizations between the managers and the non-managers in that regard. And if, even more importantly, maybe we're relying on the managers or the team leaders to be this critical, point of reference for helping the team members or the employees, is just where they are personally, so they're in the flourishing space, right, as managers. If their employees are not in the flourishing space, in general, can they really relate to the problems and issues and challenges that the employees are having, and ultimately help them, as their direct team leader or manager? So I wonder about that, and so even if we have the greatest, programs or, the greatest tools available for our employees to try to help them flourish, is there a barrier, a disconnect here when we're maybe relying on the manager, team leaders to be important people in the actualization of that? And so I think this is an area that I personally would like to dig into a lot more, as kind of I related at the very front of this presentation about that, because I think, there are bottlenecks, barriers, things here that we probably should really pay attention to as organizations. So can you comment about that too? And maybe a little bit, Todd, from the, putting your clinical psychologist hat on, when you talk about people helping people, in a sense, managers, team leaders helping employees, if they're coming from such a different place of flourishing, how can a manager or team leader really empathize, really understand and help, their people if their personal situation isn't the same?
Yeah, well, I think the key word there that you mentioned, Mike, is empathy, and that takes some time and effort to listen to the stories of the people that are working for you, to be able to put yourself in their shoes, so to speak. So I think empathy is the key, and developing a real connection, right, with your team members to kind of understand what life is like for them. And that takes some effort. And I think it's difficult when we look at the stress that is on a lot of our managers coming from the top down, right? And so if that's not emphasized from the top down, the importance of empathizing and taking some time to understand your people and what they're going through, and communicating with them, in a way that communicates care, as you mentioned earlier, right, Mike, then it makes it all the more difficult, right? Because the pressure is there to just execute, get things done, right? I mean, I have an example of a client who had to who's a high level manager, had to let somebody, she rightly, I think, took the time to talk to each of her team members individually about the whole situation, right? To really kind of show care and kind of tell them what was going on. And she was chastised by her manager for taking the time to do that. So I think there's some top-down issues, and then there's some things that managers can do to just try to take the time to listen and empathize, and just remember that, your people's experiences probably are different, and just try to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah. The other thing that's kind of popping out here for me is that, there was a CHRO of Shell years and years and years ago who kept saying in my meetings with them, with the CHROs, people are people. And so, from Shell's perspective, they're creating, programs and things that, basically kind of treated all people the same, because people were people, whether you lived in Asia or this country, that company, this demographic, this gender, people are people. And I think what we're, seeing some indications here in the data is that actually people aren't people, that there's some pretty big differences, potentially by gender, by age, by, your culture, where you're living, grow up, these kinds of things. And I think that's a real challenge for organizations to come up with personalized, solutions or personalized help for people when, their populations are so diverse, and the needs are so, different at the end of the day. So I think that this is an area, when we're looking at well-being, flourishing, that, needs a lot of attention, because, just putting out a Headspace app, and saying, oh, go meditate. And this is supposed to be, some kind of peanut butter help for our employee population. I'm not so sure, that's the right approach. And we've seen, some data that would suggest some of those things, they might get a little bit of a bump when they're initially introduced, kind of 10% uptake, and then it goes down to 1 or 2% over time. And so, that's not super helpful organizationally, obviously, if the utilization, especially over a period of time, is super low.
Right.
All
Yeah.
right.
Another quick thing to comment on, and then we'll go to the next slide, is health showing up for managers. And that's
what am I doing here? Sorry.
So mental health is showing up as, that's okay. Mental health is showing up as important for managers, and I think also for non-managers, but we're seeing this as a huge issue. And there was a recent piece in, I think it was HBR, pointing out that mental health issues are showing up at the same rates in the C-suite as at lower levels. And so that's an area of flourishing that we really need to, there needs to be more conversation, at all levels of the company. So moving on here to the matrix results, when we drill down into these different areas. So the areas for managers that showed up as in the prioritized quadrant were satisfaction with life was the main one. And these last three were right on the border there: diet, feeling of significance, and sense of peace. And then on the right, you can see that quite a few areas showed up for non-managers as they're struggling more overall. So these areas showed up in the prioritized quadrant. So again, meaning that they're saying these areas are important to them, and they're not doing very well, relatively speaking. So persistence through difficulties, saving for unexpected expenses, saving for retirement, a couple areas in finance domain, amount of contact with friends, not being lonely, satisfaction with life, sense of peace, feeling in control, energy level, clear sense of purpose, and knowing what gives meaning to my life. And we saw a clear sense of purpose show up with a number of companies that we've started to work with on this as well. So that's another important area to help people, kind of connect to their own sense of purpose and connect a sense of purpose in the company. Okay, next slide here. There we go. So a couple other interesting results about job outcomes. So when we look at some job outcomes, managers scored higher than non-managers on job satisfaction, job performance, discretionary effort, and motivated work. But they interestingly scored lower than non-managers on psychological safety and positive culture. So their perception of those things. Managers also scored higher on intent to leave. So that was a very interesting finding. So we found higher correlations between flourishing and job outcomes for managers compared to non-managers. And so, that may be just that work is a bigger part of their identity. That could explain that finding. Secondly, we found for managers only, the intent to leave was positively correlated with flourishing. So that's interesting. Small to moderate correlation. Better they're doing in terms of flourishing, the higher their intent to leave company. And then for non-managers only, we found a positive correlation between flourishing and psychological safety and positive culture. So their perception of the culture seems to impact them a little bit more for non-managers. So we're gonna transition to another poll question here. What domains are most important to your company? So of those 7, and you should see the poll up there. So you can go ahead and answer that, and then we'll pop the results up, and then we will transition back to Mike.
So our curiosity about these domains and how well you're doing. Interesting, meaning and purpose. So as Todd and Mike have shared, we've been having conversations with a number of organizations who are participating in the Flourishing Metrics assessment. And I find it absolutely fascinating that meaning and purpose continues to bubble up to the very top for almost every conversation we've had so far. And, even in our own companies, we're exploring this and the meaning it has for our employees. And I know we've got a couple of case studies and conversations we want to share with you next that might also give you some more insight on this as well.
Okay, great. Let me make sure I can All right, so we wanted to give you a case example. We've obviously, stripped out the company name and all of that kind of information, so you don't know who this is, but this was an organization who had a sample of their employees take the assessment, and then obviously created this report. It was interesting for us, and we've done a lot of these now, that employees found that it was kind of fun. A lot of times I don't think taking an employee engagement survey, people would say that's much fun. So there is that aspect. And then I think the comment about, the company's never really asked me these questions before. And I think it's an indication that, the company cares, because they are asking these questions. And then, of course, they have to, work towards addressing them. So they can't just ask them and, we're done. So it puts the onus, I think, back on the organization to do something about these things, just like with any survey that gets done within a company. But I think this one could be even more important because, do I care much about, telling a company how engaged I am and how they can make me more engaged? I get that that's good for the company. I'm not so sure sometimes why that's good for me as the employee. But this is obviously clearly important to me because it's about me at the end of the day. And so I think this is great information. So as you get this report, there is this summary. So you get your score, how many, your average score by company, right? And then, how many participants and, where your team stands against the database that we've created and we continually, look at. And then, the flourishing by domain, like Todd showed you before, where are you as a company overall against the domains? And then again, where's the benchmark? Where's the average? And then we start breaking it down by some demographics that we think organizations will be very interested in. Age is important, right? Tenure is important, gender is important, location, race, ethnicity is important. So we're trying to get, below the covers here a little bit and understand the data by these different categories. And then, of course, once you have the data, if the data set is big enough, then you can start doing, what about 25, to 34-year-olds that are female in Asia, right? You could start doing those kinds of cuts of the data and slicing it, dicing it, more inclusively. But, this is the way, as Todd showed, the results came out for this company. So, one of the companies that we did this with, they had done what they thought was a huge amount of work of connecting individual purpose to organizational mission, if you will, the purpose of the company versus your individual purpose and how you can connect those dots. And that's important, for tenure and for your engagement. The data, the research has shown, but a lot of times in the prioritized quadrant, this idea of purpose appeared again, right? And so they were like, oh gosh, we think we've spent, lots of time and maybe lots of money on this idea of connecting these dots. And clearly through this data, it's showing that we haven't had the outcome we thought maybe we were having. So that's important. The other thing, and Marie talks about this a lot, is, you're always doing some things that are good, that are having a positive impact, and you should know that, and you should celebrate that. And so that's why, this isn't an assessment that's just sort of intended to bang a company over the head and say, you're really not doing well, or you're not doing well in a lot of different areas. It's also to provide the positive side of that, where, hey, looks like you are doing some things super well, or people are reacting very positive to it, and you should continue those or build upon those, right? So it's as complex as a human being is, if we look at the data organizationally, you have pluses and minuses and good and bad and all these kinds of things. So I think this is a great way, ultimately at looking at the data. And you can just see, again, we're just showing you for representative sake how this company came out. So around character and virtue, here, review had a lot of things in it. And this is the way we kind of relate this is stuff to keep on your radar. This is stuff to maybe take a look at other analytics that you have in your company around maybe some of these areas. And is this an early warning, indicator of issues, problems, challenges to come in this area of review, right? And so this can be a powerful place to look, to not just prioritize, but in this category of review. And just
I would just
go ahead, Marie.
I would just add real quick too that interestingly on the meaning and purpose is that this particular company had invested a considerable amount of time and effort on the company meaning and purpose and trying to correlate that with their own employees. And when this slide came up in our presentation with them, it was exciting in that they felt that, oh, the work has been successful. We're celebrating quite a bit in the meaning and purpose category. So it's another great way to validate and help you continue to prioritize the right things for your company.
Yeah. And just to, kind of connect the dot with this network that we're forming on well-being and flourishing, the whole idea here is to, one, have this data to say, well, company A, my company is, has strengths and weaknesses here. Company B has strengths and weaknesses there. If a company is really doing a great job from the data on meaning and purpose, well, what are they doing? What are they doing, and what, are they best next practices that we can adopt in our organization to try to improve or move our data up around that area, that domain, that category. So that's the kind of sharing in a very high trust, confidential environment, because this is, pretty, data that you clearly may not want to see out in the public domain. So we have this ability to share and to learn from each other in this very high trust, confidential environment of our network that we're forming. And then as you can see here, there is kind of a summary here over on the right where we try to take, the overall data, and then just by domain, if you were to focus on one thing, based on the data, what would that one thing be by domain, right? And there might be areas where you don't have any prioritized, right? And that's then left blank here, as you can see. So again, I don't know if this is like the executive slide or something, what do we really care about, focusing on, but it's just another way of kind of visualizing, the data. So again, oops, I'm sorry. We're almost to the end here. We really do think that organizations need to make well-being and flourishing a priority. We think these managers, team leaders are really central to this. So if you haven't thought about that in depth, maybe that's an area to focus in on. That really this, things change every day for people, right? Things happen to them every day. So their flourishing score is going up and down basically every day, right? So this idea of regular assessments may be a way to go. We do have this app that, interestingly, as people do the assessments on their own for their own individual score, often once a month or something like that, there's a way of actually aggregating that data, up to the organizational level, and providing almost like real-time intelligence around how your people are flourishing, in that context. And then maybe you layer in the organizational type assessments, maybe more quarterly or something, biannually or something like that. And you get the nice connectivity between the real time and the more holistic organizational data from the top down. We do see, as I mentioned with that purpose example, that companies are reevaluating, using the data to reevaluate what they're doing, in a pretty holistic way. So what are the things in whether it comes out of benefits or total reward area, or we are seeing a lot of companies, and we had an example of this with Delta a week or so ago, where they both hired a chief medical officer, and they now have basically a senior VP of well-being. And they hired this guy from the Mayo Clinic, who is like, he said he'd written 450 papers on, well-being in these areas. And we're like, wow. So obviously a company like Delta investing in those kinds of people are saying something, right, about their plans and what they're, going to be focused on. And it was interesting at Delta that they're not just interested in their employees. That's where they're starting. That's where the initial focus is, but then also on their customers ultimately, and trying to help their customers flourish at the end of the day, in addition to, so taking what they're building and investing in out to their, their suppliers, or to their value chain, or to the families of their employees, or to the communities where they operate. I think this kind of idea of the extended enterprise and the ecosystem is very interesting to think about, in this context. So I know we just have a couple more minutes here, but we wanted to spend a second talking about this network. So this is a network for a team from companies that would join the network, because well-being isn't like really a function yet. Maybe like at Delta, maybe it's evolving to having a kind of a functional leader of it, but a lot of times it's a little more fragmented in an organization, kind of who owns this area for an organization. So the idea is to have a team. We have some really great companies that have already committed to the network, and it's going to be, what Executive Networks does, super large, super global companies in the network, and be a model that for the first time, as Todd mentioned, brings in a academic and research partner as an active member and participant of the network. And that's, Harvard, and the Human Flourishing program at Harvard will be a part of the network. And, Tyler will show up, Todd will be there, and stuff. And I think it'll be a different type of network than our current networks are today. So if you're interested, please reach out. And then we'd like to pose this question to you as kind of, the end point here. And if you could answer it in chat, what would benefit you the most from participating in this kind of a network? If you were to join, what would you like to get out of it? Both strategically, maybe, and tactically in this regard. So if you can use the chat to answer that question, and then again, we'll synthesize all of this, send you out, if you want, this deck and this recording, and the answers, the word cloud, and the answer to the poll, and the answer to this question, because we want to make sure you have some ammo to go back into your organization and to activate some things, get some things moving forward in a positive way. So Todd, any summation here? Marie?
No, I think you covered it well. We're excited to partner with companies in this important area, and yeah.
I think there's a lot of opportunity to harness the great learning and insights that each of these participating companies will have. And I think being able to turn around and share that back out with everyone is extraordinary, and it's a unique opportunity. So we look forward to connecting with each of you. And again, please stay tuned to Executive Networks and Flourishing Metrics, as the data and insights is compelling, and we're going to keep making sure that all of you have access to it.
Okay. Well, continue in chat for another couple minutes. So we won't shut it down until the top of the hour. But if you've given us your feedback there, we'll give you a couple minutes back to your day, which I think is always appreciated in this Zoom world we live in. So thank you, everyone, and be safe and well.